In the early hours of the 1st of May, a violent explosion shook Iran's Janj province and left a trail of bodies behind. At least 14 members of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps were reported dead, turning what might have been described as a local military incident into a national security crisis. And from the very first moments, the central question was not only what exploded, but whether Iran was telling the full story. According to Iranian media, the official explanation was that an unexploded bomb had detonated during handling or transports, and that alone is grim enough. But in a region already defined by covert strikes, retaliatory threats, and silent escalation, an unexploded munition is never just a technical detail. It becomes a clue. If that device really came from a previous airstrike, then the blast may point toward a hidden chain of military activity involving Israel, or possibly even the United States. If the official story is incomplete, and then the explosion in Janj may represent something much larger than an accident. It may be the visible edge of a campaign that has not been publicly acknowledged, and this is where the fog thickens. Iran has faced prolonged internet disruption for more than 2 months, making independent verification extremely difficult in an environment where outside reporting is restricted and domestic narratives are tightly managed. Every fact arrives wrapped in uncertainty, and every denial sounds less definitive than it should. Still, one point matters. Iranian media acknowledge that the incident happened. That admission alone suggests the explosion was serious, substantial, and impossible to hide completely. The argument now is not over whether something occurred, but over the true nature of what occurred. Was this a battlefield remnant accidentally triggered by Iranian personnel? Was it a sabotage operation? Was it the result of a previously planted device, poor ordnance handling, or an internal breach? In moments like this, the number of dead is only the first layer. The real story is what those deaths reveal about the condition of the Iranian state, the vulnerability of its elite forces, and the strategic pressure surrounding it. Suspicion has not emerged in a vacuum. In recent weeks, a series of mysterious deaths involving members of the Revolutionary Guard has added to the sense that something is deeply unstable beneath the surface. Analysts looking at this pattern have begun to ask whether these are isolated incidents or whether key personnel are being tracked, targeted, and eliminated as part of a broader campaign. If that darker interpretation is correct, then the Janj explosion may not stand alone. It may be one link in a longer chain of operations, one more strike in a pressure strategy designed to weaken Iran from within while avoiding open war. That does not make the theory proven, but it explains why this blast has drawn so much attention far beyond the immediate casualty count. And the casualty count itself may still rise. Reports indicated that several others were seriously wounded, meaning the final toll may be higher than the initial figure of 14 killed. That would make the blast one of the bloodiest incidents since the ceasefire period began earlier in the month, and a stark signal that the calm many hoped for may have been more illusion than reality. At the same time, reports have circulated suggesting that Israel could soon declare negotiations a failure and reopen the path toward renewed strikes on Iranian facilities. And on their own, such reports are not shocking. Similar warnings have appeared repeatedly in both Israeli and American media, and they often function as part of a prolonged information battle as much as a preview of actual operations. But what elevated concern was the direct language coming from Israel's defense minister. He stated that Israel may soon have to act again inside Iran to ensure that the regime cannot threaten Israel for years, to become that is no longer a whisper, and it is no longer an indirect hint. It is a public warning delivered in official language with strategic weight behind it. Even so, a hardline Israeli statement does not automatically prove that every explosion inside Iran is the work of Tel Aviv or Washington. In a period this tense, abnormal events naturally attract geopolitical interpretation. Yet the more unusual part of this story may be that some of the strongest suspicions about instability are now coming not from foreign adversaries, but from Iranian officials themselves. Within Iran, there are increasing signs that the leadership fears internal unrest at least as much as external attack. A member of parliament, Sabeti, openly acknowledged that access to the global internet has been restricted during wartime to prevent the organization of disruptive activities. He warned that if full internet access were restored, groups he described as mercenaries, possibly even armed ones, could use digital platforms to assemble and mobilize. That statement is revealing. Governments do not speak that way unless they believe the threat is real. When senior figures publicly frame open internet access as a security danger, they are admitting that internal control has become a central battlefield. This matters because it changes how incidents like the Janj explosion are interpreted. Instead of seeing every blast only through the lens of foreign war, observers must also consider domestic security, breakdown, infiltration fears, and the possibility that parts of the state are now operating under intense internal stress. In such a climate, accidents, sabotage, suppression, and military secrecy can overlap until they become almost impossible to separate. Sabeti went even further by recalling the nationwide uprising that took place on the 8th and 9th of January, a moment that security forces reportedly crushed with severe force. He suggested that similar unrest could erupt again if exceptional controls, especially internet restrictions, were lifted. And that is an extraordinary admission because it implies that the state's grip on social stability remains fragile. According to his remarks, the internet shutdown was not a temporary technical step or a local measure. It was presented as a direct order from Iran's Supreme National Security Council, and one that would remain in place for as long as wartime conditions continued. In other words, information control has become not an emergency reflex, but a strategic doctrine. And that has consequences far beyond communication. Economic pressure deepens when a country is digitally isolated. Businesses suffer, families lose access, and normal life is distorted. Yet the leadership appears willing to absorb that cost if it helps prevent coordinated unrest, which suggests that fear of internal fragmentation may now rival fear of foreign military strikes. Reports from inside Iran paint an even darker picture. Executions have reportedly continued, meaning that deaths linked to the January protests may not have ended with the demonstrations themselves. What began as street repression appears, in these accounts, to have shifted into a post-crisis phase of legal and extra-legal punishment. Iran's Chief Justice publicly reinforced this hard line, speaking on live television. He said that one of the legitimate demands of the people was for criminals, collaborators with the enemy, and those suspected of serving hostile forces to be identified quickly, arrested, and tried without delay officially. This was framed as law, justice, and due process politically. It sounded like a declaration that the purge would continue. That distinction is critical. When suspicion alone becomes enough to trigger state action, the boundary between security enforcement and political repression becomes dangerously thin. In such conditions, punishment does not merely remove perceived threats. It sends a message to everyone else. The judiciary's stance became even more uncompromising when criticism of death sentences was publicly dismissed. The argument was that those who oppose executions have no right to seek leniency for people accused of spilling blood or weakening wartime security. That language leaves almost no room for dissent, and it suggests that fear is being used not only to defend the state, but to reorganize society around obedience. At the same time, security pressure appears to be spreading into the technological sphere. There are allegations that the Revolutionary Guard has treated access to unauthorized internet systems, especially Starlink, as a direct national security threat. If true, that means the act of connecting to the outside world has become politically charged and potentially life-threatening. One case repeatedly cited in reports involves a man named Aladdin, a father of two, who was allegedly detained for using Starlink to access the internet. According to those reports, he later died after being beaten in custody. These claims require independent verification, and such verification remains extremely difficult. But even as allegations, they reveal the level of fear surrounding uncontrolled communication. Starlink was reportedly banned in Iran from the 28th of the month when the war began. The ban itself is significant, but what matters even more is the way it has allegedly been enforced. If arrests, disappearances, or deaths are linked to internet access, then the state is not merely limiting information, it is criminalizing independent connection. Some reports go further, alleging that certain detainees never reached a courtroom at all. In these accounts, individuals accused of maintaining unauthorized contact with the outside world were dealt with inside the detention system itself. Again, these are claims that demand caution, but taken together, they describe a society in which information is no longer just power, it is evidence, suspicion, and sometimes a death sentence. The allegations surrounding Aladdin follow that same pattern. Reports say no public evidence was presented, no meaningful chance for defense was provided, and no formal court appearance took place before his reported death in public detention. Even more disturbing are claims that the body was withheld and returned to the family only after they agreed not to speak publicly about what happened. This would not be without precedent. During earlier crackdowns, there were similar reports that bodies were centralized at specific locations for family identification under controlled conditions. If such methods are being repeated, then the struggle inside Iran is not confined to protest, prison, or the street. It extends into the management of death, memory, and silence. Some of the most controversial claims concern the treatment of families after a relative is killed. According to these reports, bodies were returned only if families accepted strict conditions, including payment for the bullet used and signing statements that the deceased had been aligned with the state rather than with demonstrators. If true, this would point to a system designed not only to suppress unrest, but to rewrite its narrative after the fact. All of this creates a deeply unstable internal picture. Yet, while the domestic front appears increasingly tense, the diplomatic front remains clouded by uncertainty. There have been almost no substantial public updates on negotiations, even though earlier reporting suggested Iran had sent a new proposal that was viewed as somewhat more positive than the one submitted roughly a week earlier. The problem is that the content of that proposal has not been fully disclosed. Without details, it is impossible to determine whether Iran made a meaningful concession or merely adjusted its tone. In high-stakes diplomacy, ambiguity can be useful. It can also be a sign that neither side wants the public to know how far apart they still are. From Washington, the tone has been far from encouraging. Donald Trump said that Iran wants a deal, but he was not satisfied with what was being offered. He argued that Iran seeks an agreement because it has, in his words, very little military capability left, and he described its leadership as fragmented, unfriendly, and internally divided. Whether one accepts that assessment or not, the strategic message is clear. Washington wants Iran seen as weak, divided, and under pressure. That framing serves a purpose at the negotiating table, because a country portrayed as diminished is a country expected to concede. Trump expanded on that message in even harsher terms, claiming that Iran's naval and air capabilities had been largely destroyed and that many of its soldiers had been killed. He said the country had been severely shattered and needed to make the right deal. These are not neutral descriptions. They are instruments of pressure intended to shape both diplomacy and perception. There is also another layer here. By emphasizing fractures within Iran's leadership, Washington is not only criticizing Tehran, it is also suggesting that Iran may lack a coherent decision-making center. That creates two very different strategic possibilities. One, a weakened rival, more likely to compromise, or two, a fragmented state more prone to miscalculation and sudden escalation. Reporting on the latest proposal suggests it was not entirely new, but rather a response to American revisions conveyed by White House envoy Steve Witkoff. According to accounts from journalists following the process closely, Witkoff's changes were designed to pull the discussion back toward the core issue of Iran's nuclear program. So that is important because it appears Iran had sought to narrow the scope of the talks and shift emphasis toward other strategic concerns. This may be the central diplomatic fault line. Tehran seems to prefer limiting the conversation. Washington wants the negotiations anchored in the nuclear file. When the two sides are not even prioritizing the same subject, progress becomes extremely difficult. Sources indicate that Iran's latest response may have moved somewhat closer to American demands, but still fell short of full acceptance. That would explain Trump's repeated insistence that he remained dissatisfied. In other words, the distance may have narrowed, but not enough to produce breakthrough. That unresolved gap matters because the nuclear issue is not a side question. It is the heart of the entire negotiation. If that core dispute cannot be settled, then every parallel tension, from covert action to regional force posture, becomes more dangerous. And there are signs that Washington is preparing for precisely that possibility. Reports suggest that American military logistics activity in the Middle East has not slowed down. On the contrary, supply aircraft have reportedly continued to move in and out of bases and operating points across the region at a heightened pace, indicating that readiness is being maintained for multiple scenarios. The situation appeared to move into a more serious phase when Trump reportedly attended a highly classified meeting with senior military commanders. At that level, diplomacy is no longer the only topic. Military options are being actively reviewed, and that sends a message to allies, adversaries, and negotiators alike. According to the account presented, Trump asked his commanders a stark question. Should he strike hard and completely destroy them, or should the United States keep trying to reach a deal? He said he did not want such an outcome on human grounds, but made clear that the military option remained available. That statement captures the entire strategic dilemma in one sentence: overwhelming force or unstable diplomacy. Even if spoken partly for leverage, such language has consequences. Once destruction is discussed openly at the highest level, it ceases to be an abstract possibility. It becomes part of the operating environment, shaping calculations in Tehran, Jerusalem, and across the wider region. Trump later returned to the theme of internal fragmentation inside Iran, saying the leadership was split and unable to agree on the kind of deal it wanted. He argued that this disunity made it difficult for Washington to negotiate, because one faction sought one arrangement while another sought something different. Even the hardliners, he suggested, wanted an agreement because Iran no longer had a navy and air force or functioning air defenses left. Again, this is not simply description. It is strategic signaling, but it also highlights a paradox. A divided leadership may be easier to pressure, yet harder to settle with, because no one can guarantee that today's understanding will survive tomorrow's internal struggle. That is why the Janj explosion matters beyond the immediate loss of life. It sits at the intersection of every pressure point now bearing down on Iran. Military vulnerability, covert threat, leadership strain, public fear, information control, and diplomatic uncertainty. A single blast in a single province has become a mirror reflecting the condition of an entire state under stress. What happened in Janj may have been an accident, it may have been negligence, it may have been sabotage, or it may have been part of a larger undeclared campaign unfolding in fragments, with each fragment deniable on its own, but revealing in accumulation. At this stage, certainty is scarce, and that scarcity is itself part of the story. What can be said with confidence is that the environment around Iran is becoming more combustible, not less. Israel is speaking more openly about possible renewed action. Washington is keeping military options visible, while diplomacy struggles to gain traction. Inside Iran, the leadership appears deeply preoccupied with unrest, control, and the threat of internal fracture. So the real question is no longer just what exploded in Janj. The deeper question is what kind of system produces an event like this and then surrounds it with so much silence, fear, and strategic ambiguity. Was this the sound of one munition detonating or the sound of a broader order beginning to crack? How did such a deadly blast happen inside a guarded military structure? And why does the official account leave so many openings? Why is internet control being treated as a wartime front? And if negotiations fail while domestic pressure rises? So what does that mean for the next phase of confrontation between Iran, Israel, and the United States? These are the questions shaping the region now, not clean answers, not simple headlines, questions, and in geopolitics, when the questions multiply faster than the facts, that is usually the moment when the danger is still building. For now, the old balance remains under strain. The myth of control is weakening. The sense of invulnerability on all sides is being tested by a reality that is increasingly fragmented, increasingly militarized, and increasingly difficult to predict. If this was only an accident, it was an accident with strategic consequences. If it was something more, then Janj may be remembered as one of those moments when history did not announce itself clearly at first, but arrived through smoke, confusion, and the sudden loss of 14 lives. Watch this closely. The next move may come through diplomacy, through covert action, or through force. But one thing is already clear. The pressure surrounding Iran is no longer distant, and the struggle over its future is being fought on every level at once. If you think this was merely a military mishap, say so. If you believe it points to a wider campaign, make that case. Like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and leave your view in the comments. Because the balance of power in this region may be shifting in ways that are only beginning to be visible.